Well, the talk focuses on Midgley's influential discussions over more than 30 years of the relationship between human beings and animals. And in particular, on her concern to, as she puts it, remove the barriers that stand in the way of proper understanding and treatment of animals. These barriers, she argues, have been erected by animal science, by epistemology, and by mainstream moral philosophy alike. And in each case, she argues, our attitudes to animals are warped by approaches that are at once excessively abstract, over-theoretical, and guilty of a kind of collective hubris on the part of humankind. And to remove these barriers, what's required is not another theory of how and why animals matter, but attention to actual engagements with animals and to the moral failings or vices that distort people's relations to animals. We are animals, is the opening sentence of Mary Midgley's first book, Beast and Man. No human has ever been anything but an animal, she writes over 30 years later, in what I think was probably her last paper dealing with animals. Well, those bookend remarks indicate Mary's standing interest in the relationship between humans and non-human animals. And these writings of hers on animals cover a host of topics, ranging from general philosophical ones, why do animals matter, are animals persons, to particular issues of animal welfare, confinement in zoos, for example, or factory farming. It's important to stress, I think, that her attention to animals isn't incidental to or hived off from her wider philosophical concerns. Indeed, I hope to show that her criticisms of various views about animals are of a piece with her rejection of scientism and other myths we live by, to cite the title of one of her books. And of a piece, too, with her lament for the atrophy, as she sees it in the modern world, of wonder and cosmic humility. Well, the clarity and power of Midgley's writings on animals have ensured that they have a considerable influence in the world of animal welfare, as well as upon many philosophers, myself included, whose thinking about animals has been shaped by those writings. That said, you won't find Mary Midgley cited and discussed in the professional animal ethics literature, in the journals especially, with anything like the frequency of some other figures, such as Peter Singer and Tom Regan. And this, I think, is because she critically distances herself from the mainstream or orthodox approaches in animal ethics represented by such authors and to which the journal literature tends to pay such detailed attention. I'm going to focus on two central themes in Midgley's writings on animals, both belonging to her abiding ambition to remove the barriers, as she puts it, that have been erected against concern for animals. First of all, there's the epistemological theme relating to our understanding of animal lives. And this consists in a critique of behaviorism ritual skepticism and other refusals to accept that many animals have a rich subjective life that we can at least partly understand. And second, an ethical theme, a rejection of mainstream ethical theories, including utilitarianism and ones that centre on rights, justice and equality. Well, I'm going to take up those themes in a moment, but after first responding to a worry that in highlighting these themes, I may be ignoring what some people might regard as Midgley's paramount claim, the one quoted earlier, to the effect that human beings are. They're not anything but animals. Well, my response to this claim actually registers one of my few points of disagreement with Mary Midgley. So let's get it out of the way. My view is that the question of whether humans are animals is just best set aside. I mean, coolly regarded, the question's a dull one, a no-brainer. I mean, in one obvious sense, humans are a kind of animal. They ingest, they metabolize, they move themselves around, and so on. But equally obviously, a human being is not an animal in the familiar sense, one given in the OED, of being, quote, a brute or beast as distinguished from man. I mean, if I tell you that there is an animals in the next door's garden, it would be taken as a joke or an insult if I was referring to my neighbour's children. In effect, I think humans are just animals is a slogan, and I think not really a very good one. It's wrong for a start to suppose, as I think many people do, that humans are animals somehow indicates that our differences from other animals are vastly outweighed by the similarities. Peter Hacker begins his book, Human Nature, with the words, "Human beings are animals," but immediately adds, "with a distinctive range of abilities." And his book then, in fact, focuses on precisely those distinctive abilities, including linguistic and cognitive ones, and in effect argues that the differences between us and other animals are much greater than many scientists and philosophers imagine. I think it's mistaken, too, to think that the slogan, "Humans are animals," registers or inspires a sort of tender moral concern for animals. Social Darwinists insisted that human beings were a species of animal, but then argued that precisely because we are, we're also engaged in a red in tooth and claw, no-holds-barred struggle for supremacy with other species. Conversely, the Buddha and St. Francis of Assisi denied that human beings were just animals, but are famed for their compassion towards animals. So I think we're better off without slogans, but if you are wedded to the slogan, "Human beings are animals," it mustn't be allowed to mask salient or deep differences between people and other animals. Not least because some uniquely human capacities need to be emphasized in any proper appraisal of our treatment of animals. For example, the distinctively human capacities for hubris, willful ignorance, hardness of heart, vanity, self-deception, and the enjoyment of killing animals. Now, these, of course, are not distinctive aspects of human being that Mary Midgley pastes over. On the contrary. But this seems to me this is despite, not because of, her insistence that humans are nothing but animals. So let's return then, with slogans set aside, to the two themes, epistemological and ethical, that I announced. I want to show that her criticism of behaviorism and its relatives is closely related to her criticism of mainstream animal ethics. Both are guilty of, first, being over-theoretical, overly abstract, lacking in realism and in attention to real-life engagements with animals. And they're both guilty, second, of hubris, of an unwanted elevation of humankind above other species. And Midgley, I think, was well aware of the connection between her two critical targets. She writes, "To grasp more fully how their lives work, through engaging with animals, inevitably gives us a sense of fellowship with them that's incompatible with hubris." So first then, what I'm calling the epistemological theme. The target is the behaviorist or skeptical idea that the subjective feelings and mental life generally of animals are quite hidden from us, cannot concern us, and may not even exist. And in at least two respects, she argues, this idea betrays an excess of theory, a lack of realism. First, it typically relies on loading perfectly ordinary concepts, like those of understanding, belief, hope, with theoretical baggage that they don't carry in everyday talk and practice. For example, a very important example, consider the insistence that nothing can count as believing or hoping unless it involves the exercise of language. If you insist on that, then in conjunction with a suitably demanding notion of language, it'll follow that animals can't believe or hope, or at any rate that we've got no reason to suppose that they can. And Midgley's response to this kind of line of thought is very blunt. Quote, "Neither with dog nor human do we need words to reveal to us what expressive capacities far older and far deeper than words make clear immediately." Second, and relatedly, the skepticism of behaviorists and their cousins is a ritual skepticism, she says. It's artificial, hollow, something to which only lip service can be given. It's not something that people who actually deal with animals, like vets and animal trainers, can genuinely embrace. And even biologists, like she mentions Tinbergen, who may proclaim it in the prefaces to their books, soon forget about it when they proceed to record their sort of engaged experiences with animals. All the skepticism drops out. I mean, not only does ritual skepticism bluntly contradict what anyone who engages with animals knows, for example, that cutting off a puppy's tail hurts it. It's also incompatible with any skillful intercourse with animals. I mean, a sceptical mahout who decided that it was pointless to inquire whether his elephant was angry, suspicious, pleased or excited, he'd not only be out of business, but he'd probably be dead. Attributing subjectivity to animals, or simply seeing it manifested in their behaviour, is a precondition of intelligent engagement with them. Proclamations of scepticism, then, are only possible for detached observers for whom the movements, gestures, cries and faces of animals, or indeed of men and women, are just data from which it's problematic to infer emotions, moods and beliefs. By contrast, for the vet, the mahout and the pet owner, whose lives are led in the company of animals, the idea that there's a problem here is just idle. Turning to Mary Midgley's second kind of criticism of behaviourism and its cousins, she wants to say, I think, that they also betray a kind of collective hubris on the part of humankind, that they feed a sense of a special human uniqueness that places us above animals. Now, that's a sense that may, for some people, in itself be gratifying. But it serves also, she says, to establish that we have a right to exploit other animals. It encourages a perception of them as things or products. I mean, there are, of course, striking examples from religions in which human beings are elevated above other creatures. Only human beings are made in the image of God, or they're the purpose of God's creation, or humans alone are capable of liberation from the cycle of rebirth, or whatever. But Midgley's focus is on how, in modern times, science has inherited the hubris of religion, noting, ironically, that thinkers such as Auguste Comte and Julian Huxley commandeer the term religion for the enthusiasm they urge for human, especially scientific, achievements. For Midgley, this anthropolatry, or human self-worship, this faith in human beings as the culmination of evolution and the masters of the universe, represents an, quote, absurd overestimate of human separateness and superiority. It's an overestimate that behaviourism and its allies at once reflect and reinforce. It's no accident that it's in practices towards animals which are the most technologically and scientifically informed, such as factory farming, vivisection, genetic engineering, that it's here that we encounter the many distancing devices that people employ to disguise, perhaps from themselves, the import of their practices. It's easier, Mary notes, to run a battery farm or work in animal laboratories if you think a chicken is just a very efficient converting machine, or that a rat is a standardized biological research tool. As I think Montaigne would have agreed, only a very vainglorious species could describe other species in terms like that. Okay, so now I want to turn to Mary Midgley's critique of contemporary animal ethics, of what she and I are calling mainstream theories in the field. Well, I don't think many people would deny that the dominant approach, one common to utilitarian, rights-based and other theories, is something like the following. How animals should be treated and regarded depends on their possession or otherwise of moral status or moral considerability, as some writers put it. And for them to possess moral status, they must have features identical to or relevantly similar to those in virtue of which we human beings have moral status. They must, say, be sentient, capable of pleasure and pain, or be relatively autonomous subjects of a life, or possessed of a certain dignity, or parties to some implicit contract. Failure of moral regard for animals, if they have such features, as many of them surely do, is going to be a violation of principles of equality, justice, and indeed reason. It's discriminatory, the mainstream theorist argues. It's a speciesist attitude comparable to racist or ageist attitudes that ignore the moral status of certain human beings. I mean, the idea, this idea, which I think is rather common to lots of moral theories about animals, this idea is often cast in terms of the image of an expanding moral circle. Moral regard, the story goes, begins, as it were, at home, with one's family and friends, perhaps, but we're then compelled by logic to extend this regard to any beings that are relevantly similar to family and friends. Historically, it's taken a very long time for this circle to expand so as to include all human beings. And it may take much longer for everyone to agree that it should include animals as well. The expansion of the moral circle is, in effect, a process of reason, of gradually appreciating that it's irrational to use this or that difference between people or between them and animals as a ground for withholding moral regard. Now, Midgley is not against moral theory in the harmless sense of philosophical reflection on moral concepts, or on, as she puts it, the rules and principles, standards and ideals that emerge in our efforts to guide ourselves through the jungle of the human condition. But there's also a kind of moral theorizing, she says, producing highly abstract theories and sweeping generalizations that gives philosophy a bad name, and rightly so. And for Midgley, mainstream theory of the kind I sketched in animal ethics is of this kind. Bluntly put, mainstream theory's abstractions betray a lack of realism and of the necessary attention to the contexts and facts of our complex relationships with animals. This lack of realism is perfectly illustrated by that image of the expanding moral circle. I mean, far from regard for animals, moral regard for animals, being a very late, only recently emerged moral concern, and all societies have always been mixed, as Midgley calls it, or multi-species ones, in which at least some and sometimes very many animals, have been regarded as social beings, fellow members of human communities, to which duties of care are owed. Indeed, the further we go back to, say, totemic and nomadic societies, the greater are the moral links and fellowship between beast and man. In plenty of traditional societies, some animals have received greater moral regard than some humans. So the idea that morality, the history of morality, can be represented by concentric circles that grow outwards to include, one by one, neighbours, women, slaves, foreigners, and eventually animals, this is just an historical nonsense. This unrealistic image of the expanding moral circle can only be taken seriously by theorists who wrench concepts like respect, dignity, rights, person from the actual contexts in which they have sense and force and turn them instead into abstractions. I mean, for example, the idea that all mammals as such, are in effect persons possessed of dignity and rights and therefore owed respect, would be unintelligible to hunter-gatherers whose respect for, say, bears owes to their particular relationship to the animals. Unintelligible to tribespeople who count as persons only those animals with whom they share a communal life. Or to farmers, traditional farmers, whose dogs, oxen and horses have a dignity that's earned and manifested through the uncomplaining work they do. Or indeed unintelligible to someone whose pet has rights that other animals don't have precisely through being his or her pet. Now, you don't owe the duties to the pet down the street that you owe to yours. Wrenched out of real-life contexts, talk of animal rights, dignity and the like is hollow, and its implications for the treatment of animals opaque. Midgley writes, "The word right cannot be salvaged for any clear, unambiguous use once it's abstracted from concrete relationships between people and animals in actual societies." The idea that it's discriminatory, hence unreasonable, not to extend moral regard to creatures that are relevantly similar to ourselves, this itself suffers from its abstractness. Again, Midgley writes, "The notion of equality is a tool for rectifying injustices within a given group whose members count as equals. It's not a tool for widening that group." And what constitutes a relevant similarity between people and animals, or between different animals, can't be separated from what in practice people do regard as relevant. And the hunter-gatherer who extends to wolves the regard he's already got for bears isn't noticing some general similarity between the two species, such as intelligence, but bringing wolves into the same sphere of practices and attitudes hitherto occupied by bears. And there's just no point in insisting that sentience, for example, is a relevant similarity, morally relevant similarity between beast and man to people who just don't see that a mouse's susceptibility to pain has any significance. to someone like the scientist that Midgley quotes, who asked whether sentient animals should morally count for anything at all, replied, well, no, why should they? Very general properties that, according to this or that moral theorist, make for relevant similarity to human beings. Midgley mentions sensibility and complexity of life. Such very general properties are anyway bound to leave implications for practice very obscure. The locust's sensibility and complexity are less, presumably, than those of a dog. But of course there are a lot more locusts than there are dogs. And Mary asks, with a dose of sarcasm, should the joint sensibility of hundreds of thousands of locusts outweigh that of a dog, or even of the small human settlement that the huge swarm of locusts is about to overwhelm? Instead of worrying about these and other remote, idle questions that moral status theories are bound to generate, we should instead, she says, operate within the limits of what we can know and try to do. Okay, so I now want to turn to her second criticism of mainstream moral theories, and this parallels her second charge against behaviorism and skepticism. It's the charge of sort of collective hubris. Now, this may seem a strange charge to level against writers who typically want to extend and to cement our moral concern for animals. The trouble, though, with the mainstream focus on the extension of rights, justice, respect, etc., the emphasis on combating irrational discrimination, is, Midgley explains, that concern about justice and the like now monopolizes attention. And what lies outside the area of focus gets neglected. So that, for example, mercy and compassion begin to seem like mere matters of taste. Desirable, no doubt, but not central or serious components of the moral outlook. That's all to do with justice and discrimination. If mercy and compassion are neglected, so are the vices opposite to these virtues, notably cruelty. And this is where I think the charge of hubris enters in. The effect of mainstream theories is to paint an unduly rosy picture of humankind, in which the wrongfulness of our treatment of animals is a sort of failure of information or a failure of reason and consistency. A failure either to note the relevant similarities of animals to ourselves, or a failure to realize that these similarities entail moral regard for animals. And this surely is a picture that flatters us, because left out of the picture are, to cite just some of the terms on Midgley's list, human greed, meanness, envy, cowardice, sloth, ingratitude, and the rest of our vices, including, in most people's opinion, one of the worst vices, cruelty. When all that gets, as it were, lit up by a moral theory are justice, discrimination, and the like, our vices remain out of sight and out of mind. And that, of course, suits us very nicely, doesn't it? I mean, who wouldn't prefer to own up to failures in logic or consistency rather than admitting to the vices on the list of vices that I just read out. Much better, I'd have thought, if one's epitaph was, this man sometimes failed in reasoning, in moral reasoning, than this man was a cruel, mindless, vainglorious person. Okay, so what is it that Mary Midgley wants to put in place of mainstream theories? Well, some commentators, I think, seem to think that she replaces these by, as it were, one more moral theory. Baird Cullicott, the environmental philosopher, a big admirer of Mary Midgley, writes that while she doesn't elaborate a positive moral theory, she would surely, if pressed, sketch a Humean, David Humean ethical theory grounded in feelings, not reason. Another writer claims that she does have a theory of animals' moral status, but one grounded in relationships with people rather than in features of the animals themselves. But I think these remarks betray misunderstanding. I think for Mary Midgley, just no theory in the sense I identified is needed. That is, a theory as something intended to explain why we should treat animals thus and so, something intended to justify such treatment. For her, as for Hume and the Buddha, moral regard for animals isn't grounded in anything. Not in the way that, for mainstream theorists, it's grounded in the alleged moral status of animals. I mean, to be sure, a good person feels compassion and sympathy for the suffering of animals, but this isn't a premise from which to draw moral conclusions about how to treat them. No syllogisms are required to recognize how, in many cases, we should act. Midgley writes, confronted with a flotilla of ducklings, most people will just see that things matter to animals, and without further ado, conclude that the way in which we treat these creatures matters as well. More generally, we simply see, or we should just see, what we ought to be doing. That many things we do to animals are glaringly and unmistakably wrong. And of those who don't see this, then no amount of the rhetoric of moral status is going to secure their moral concern. Well, a concluding brief section. For Midgley, an essential way of coming to see what we ought to be doing to and for animals is to see that, seeing that many of the things we do are unmistakably wrong. An essential way to see this is to recognize these things as embodying cruelty, meanness, greed, or whatever. Indeed, what makes these things wrong is precisely that they do exemplify such vices and human failings. What's wrong with our treatment of animals is, so to speak, us. This is why, throughout her writings on concern for animals, Midgley constantly draws attention to our refusal to admit to the many failings or vices that our treatment of animals betrays. Aggression, pugnacity, sheer self-interest, and also the many vices like self-deceit, vanity, and mindlessness, that make it very easy for us to be blind to our failings, those vices included. Well, Mary Midgley doesn't quite say, as Mark Twain did, she was too nice a person, I think, that of all the creatures that were made, man is the most detestable. But she would, I'm pretty confident, endorse Montaigne's judgment that man is the most blighted and frail of all creatures, and the most given to a pride that prevents him, to the cost of billions of animals, from appreciating this. And it's this pride, or hubris, that for Mary Midgley is, if anything, the greatest of the barriers that need to be removed. Okay, thank you. That's it.